Welcome to the reflection event on the 2023 G7 Summit's commitment to greater resilience to future pandemics. My name is Tomoko Suzuki, Chief Program Officer of Japan Center for International Exchange in Tokyo. I will serve as the MC for today's event. I'm very pleased to organize this event in a partnership with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, CEPI, International Pandemic Preparedness Secretariat, and Wellcome Trust as a kickoff of the Hiroshima G7 Global Health Follow-up Initiative. This initiative was launched based on the global network built up by the Hiroshima G7 Global Health Task Force, which presented policy recommendation to the government of Japan on global health agenda for the G7 this year. Before the opening remarks, let me announce some housekeeping notes. Since we have quite a few panelists, fortunately, we are unlikely to invite comments and questions from the audience. Please share your comments with the Zoom chat function, and please use the Q&A function to ask questions for the panelists. We may not be able to pick up all the questions in the discussion, but if you include your name, we will try to send responses after this webinar. This webinar will be available on JCIE's YouTube channel later. We will let you know when it has been uploaded. Now, I would like to introduce the chair of the advisory committee for this follow-up initiative, Mr. Yasuhisa Shiozaki, former Japanese Minister of Health, Labor, and Welfare. He retired from politics in October 2021, but has become far more active in the global health arena. He is a member of the Global Leader Group on Antimicrobial Resistance and a CEPI Global Goodwill Ambassador. Shiozaki Sensei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Suzuki-san. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. And thank you very much for joining this webinar. And I'm so delighted that we are having so many distinguished speakers leading the global health arena. And I'm Yasu Shiozaki, as Suzuki-san introduced, former Minister of Health, Welfare, and Labor and Welfare. And I'm very pleased to serve as the chair of the advisory committee for the G7 Hiroshima Global Health Follow-up Initiative. In 2016, I was fully involved in the last G7 as the Minister of Health, where we adopted the G7 Hiroshima Initiative, or Hiroshima Vision for Global Health, which laid out a framework based on 4 pillars. 1, the reinforcement of the global health architecture to strengthen responses to public health emergencies. 2, the attainment of UHC with strong health systems. 3, the tackling of antimicrobial resistance. And 4, the promotion of R&D and innovation, something very similar to what we heard in Hiroshima. And for the last 3 years, we have been challenged by the unprecedented scale of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have to admit that its magnitude far exceeded our expectations at the time of the G7 Hiroshima Summit in 2016. In order to respond to future pandemics more effectively, we need to transfer the way we do business. We have to remind ourselves of 3 things. First, it is technology and the power of people and the private sector that really enabled us to contain this pandemic to the level it is at today. We all know the importance of the role of governments, but their role is to create an enabling environment for non-governmental actors to bring about their best. Second, it is the reality that each government prioritize the security and health of its own people. With this reality in mind, we still have to create a mechanism that do promote global and regional collaboration to ensure rapid response and equity in access to healthcare globally. Third, it is critical to continue our efforts to enhance resilience of our health systems. It is a tragedy that hundreds of patients died at home without any care, even in Japan, a country where universal health coverage supposed to have been the core of our health system. The last three G7 meetings intensively discussed how to strengthen global health architecture so that it will enable the global community to contain and respond to future pandemics, which of course include AMR, the slow pandemic, more effectively. Now it's time to implement the G7's commitments further and sustain all of our efforts. The Hiroshima G7 Global Health Follow-up Initiative aims to encourage the implementation of G7's commitments further through collective actions by a wide range of stakeholders. I look forward to listening to the reflections on G7's commitments from various actors and potential actions to realize them. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shirozaki Sensei. We will show two video messages, one from Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary Seiji Kihara on the overview of Hiroshima commitments. And the other video is from Mr. Love Agarwal, Additional Secretary of the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare of India. Unfortunately, he had to cancel his live participation due to an urgent business trip and has sent his video message. So please enjoy the video.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, hello, good morning, and good evening. I'm Kihara Seiji, Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary of Japan. I'm grateful for JCIE for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Last month, the G7 Hiroshima Summit was held under the chairmanship of Prime Minister Kishida. At this summit, G7 leaders discussed various challenges facing the international community, including global health, food security, sustainable development, climate change, and energy. A wide range of partners beyond the G7 committed to work together to address these challenges and share the recognitions, including on the actions we should take in the future. Every time Japan has assumed the G7 presidency, we have highlighted global health as one of the main agenda items. This January, prior to the G7 Hiroshima Summit, Prime Minister Kishida announced Japan's vision on global health through an article in The Lancet. Based on this vision, the leaders had the discussion focusing on the following three pillars. Number one, developing and strengthening global health architecture, GHA. Number two, achieving more resilient, equitable, and sustainable universal health coverage, UHC. And number three, promoting health innovation to address various health issues. Under Japan's leadership in the area of global health, the G7 demonstrated its commitment to working with partners in the international community to contribute around the world. In this process, the G7 Task Force presented their recommendations as a crystallization of the knowledge and insights of JCIE, as well as of national and international advisors of the task force. I would like to express my gratitude for your great efforts. With regard to the GHA as the first pillar, the G7 committed to further enhancing political momentum toward more coordinated and sustained leader-level governance. Under the G7 shared understanding of enhanced finance, health coordination, and PPR financing, endorsed at the Joint Finance and Health Ministers meeting, G7 will further promote financial initiatives such as strengthening finance health coordination, the pandemic fund, and surge financing. G7 members also expressed their commitment to contributing to and sustaining momentum on the negotiations of a new instrument on pandemic PPL and targeted amendments to the IHR, guided by equity and together with all stakeholders. With regard to the second pillar, in order to contribute to global health towards the post-COVID-19 era, with a view to supporting the achievement of UHC and strengthening PPR, the G7 highlighted its financial contributions totaling more than $48 billion. They also called for further domestic resource mobilization and increased private investment in global health. Japan announced an intention of contribution totaling to $7.5 billion from the public and private sectors from 2022 to 2025, which includes a pledge of $200 million from the government to the Global Health Innovative Technology Fund, GHIT Fund, to further mobilize private investment. Impact Investment Initiative for Global Health was also endorsed to encourage impact investment in global health. At the G7 Health Ministers meeting in Nagasaki, held prior to the G7 Hiroshima Summit, the health ministers issued the G7 Global Plan for UHC Action Agenda as a concrete action for achieving UHC, which was endorsed at the G7 Hiroshima Summit. Regarding the third pillar, health innovation, the G7 reiterated its commitment to promote research and development to respond to pandemics, AMR, and others. With regard to AMR, G7 confirmed the need to contribute to incentives to R&D of antimicrobials, especially the promotion of pool incentives towards the UN General Assembly high-level meeting on AMR next year. Furthermore, at the ministers' meeting, it was announced that Japan is considering contributing to CARB-X as a push incentives. Also, the G7 Hiroshima vision for equitable access to medical countermeasures was announced at the G7 Hiroshima Summit. In this vision, G7 set out principles such as equity and inclusivity for an end-to-end ecosystem that covers the entire value chain from R&D and manufacturing to delivery, and launched the MCM Delivery Partnership for Equitable Access as a concrete action. From now on, we will move into the phase of maximizing the outcomes of the G7 and of contributing to relevant forums. The government of Japan is determined to continue to play its active role at the occasion of the G20 under the Indian presidency, as well as the UN General Assembly high-level meetings on UHC, pandemic PPL, and tuberculosis. It is also important to take concrete actions based on the G7 outcomes and to make steady progress. It is very meaningful if we can incorporate the insights of experts, including all of you present today, and obtain the commitment of various stakeholders as we move forward in this endeavor. I'm very pleased that JCIE will take the lead in launching a series of follow-up activities of the G7 in parallel to and in close collaboration with those of the Japanese government. I understand that an international conference will be organized in Tokyo on November 30th this year in order to deliver a message to the G7 next year. I would like to conclude my greetings by reaffirming our determination toward achieving UHC in the post-COVID-19 era. Thank you.
Mr. Yasuhisa Shiozaki, Chair, Hiroshima G7 Global Health Follow-up Advisory Committee. Mr. Seiji Kihara, Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary from Japan. Dr. Osami Kuni, CEO and Executive Director, GHIT Fund. Dr. Michael Ryan, Executive Director, Global Health Emergency Program. Esteemed panelists and distinguished delegates, warm greetings of the day. At the outset, let me congratulate the organizers for the plan to launch a G7 Hiroshima Global Health Follow-up Initiative in order to review the progress of the G7's past commitments and identify challenges for the future. India's G20 presidency has completed 3 health working group meetings accompanied by 3 side events. Alongside, 13 co-branded events are also organized to augment the main meeting agenda and to discuss on other global health challenges. Currently, we are gearing up for the 4th Health Working Group meeting and Health Ministers meeting to be held in August 2023 in Gandhinagar. Colleagues, India's G20 presidency chose 3 priorities. First priority is health emergency, prevention, preparedness and response, which aims to create a fit-for-purpose global health architecture with an approach of convergence in global HEPPR initiatives to ensure their coherence. This priority also delves on One Health and AMR as critical areas of intervention. Second priority is to strengthen pharmaceutical cooperation, focusing on access, availability, and affordability of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, supported by R&D and manufacturing of these medical countermeasures, duly following a value for money approach. And priority 3 talks about use of technology in health service delivery as an enabler to achieve universal health coverage. Breaking the cycle of panic and neglect is a global need, and we must not let pandemic fatigue diminish our ongoing momentum in efforts on pandemic PPR. India's G20 presidency prioritized building resilience of global health systems and converging the siloed and fragmented efforts in HEPPR worldwide in sync with our G7 colleagues. India's G20 presidency also focused on AMR, given that AMR burden is a rapidly rising global public health threat. This priority received in-principle agreement on the need for a strengthened One Health-based system and AMR surveillance and consumption monitoring. We also discussed on climate change and its impact on human health. As we move toward the health ministers meeting in August, India will prioritize a prevention-first approach in its endeavor to manage future health emergencies. India's G20 presidency prioritized the MCM agenda, building on the discussions of the previous presidency and active evaluation report. We introduced the agenda on the need for a global MCM coordination platform and VTD R&D and manufacturing networks. WHO presented additional details on the framework of the proposed MCM coordination platform and such networks. There is now an alignment on the network of network approach and support for building a minimum viable product for an interim global medical measures coordination platform that should be guided by the discussions in the INB and IHR and also feed into the proposed outcomes of INB. Colleagues, Digital Health Agenda aims to promote adoption of digital tools and solutions built on the concept of digital public goods, implemented globally, utilizing accepted interoperable standards for maximizing the benefits of digital tools. India has proposed the launch of a global initiative on digital health, a WHO-managed network aimed at converging investments and efforts in the digital health space. Going forward, India looks towards launching this initiative in the month of August and seek your support for the same. Colleagues, India's G20 presidency's theme of One Earth, One Family, and One Future. India has constantly strived to bring coherence in global discussions, particularly amongst G20 and G7 countries. Having had several rounds of discussions with colleagues from Japan's G7 presidency, we realized that there is a perfect alignment between G20 and G7 Health Working Group. As shown in the slide, G7 Japan's agenda on the NCM is aligned and complements the G20 agenda for creating a global end-to-end MCM coordination platform. The launch of Hiroshima's vision for equitable access to medical countermeasures and medical countermeasures delivery partnership last month during Japanese presidency is a step in that direction. Distinguished colleagues, the next pandemic will not wait for the finalization of pandemic management treaty. Hence, the time to act is now. striving to bring convergence between India's G20 and Japan's G7 presidency has actually paved the way for effective multilateral collaboration. Our sustained collective efforts are built on the urgency to sustain political momentum and to utilize crucial time before the next pandemic may hit us. India's G20 presidency has now started the negotiations on Health Minister's declaration towards creating, converging, and consolidating ongoing efforts for a healthier future. And we look forward to the support of Hiroshima Task Force and G7 members. We need to move from principles to action and ensure that the world is better prepared to manage health emergencies. Failure to deliver on above may put millions of additional lives at stake. With this, I would like to thank all the colleagues for giving me this opportunity to share the ongoing progress of G20 Health Agenda. Thank you very much.
Now, I would like to ask Dr. Osamu Kuni, G-Hit Fund CEO and Executive Director, to moderate the panel discussion. He will serve as the Deputy Chair of the Advisory Committee of this initiative. I have to regret to inform you that Professor Keizo Takemi is sick of COVID-19 today and will not be able to deliver his concluding remarks. He asked me to send his best regards and thanks to all for joining this event. Kuni-sensei, please take the floor.
Okay, yeah. So good evening from Tokyo and good morning and good afternoon. So let's get started. Actually, I gave some of the illustrative questions to panelists, like what do you think were the most helpful commitment that G7 have made, or what are you or your organization committing and planning to do following G7 commitment? And what do you think is the most helpful process and effort for us all to work together on G7 commitment, and what could be a successful outcome and progress look like to be achieved before handling this G7 chair over to Italy? Actually, as that just said, this initiative really want to focus on action. So for making good action and to make this G7's commitment realize, we need your intervention this time. So before going into the panel discussion, I'd like to invite Mr. Michael Ryan, Executive Director, WHO Health Emergency Program, very well known to all, to share the ongoing discussions of PPR, Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness, and Response, and meaning of G7's commitments in this context. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Sama-san. And I'm joined today here by Scott Prendergast, who will probably will say a few words later, and also by Maria Van Kerkhoff, whom I'm sure many of you know after the last 3.5 years. First of all, and I think thank you for putting those questions. I think they're very pertinent questions. Let me first thank the G7 on behalf of Dr. Tedros, because certainly there's been a very consistent flow of discussion, strategic and investments in platforms over the last 3 or 4 years now, and certainly right the way through the COVID pandemic. So the leadership of the UK, then Germany, and now Japan, and the consistency the financing arrangements, the financing analyses that have been done within the G7, but also shared and worked with the Joint Finance and Health Task Force of the G20. So the coherence and the collaboration between the two Gs is very evident, and the consistency then between the different presidencies of the G7 and then the G20. I think this is exceptionally helpful as we move forward, because we're at a very important inflection point now as we look to PPR to the future. The fake has been terminated by Dr. Tedros, but the pandemic is now over. We are dealing with over 50 graded emergencies, health emergencies around the world at one time. Cholera is present in 25 countries. Dengue and chikungunya are raging in the Americas. We're seeing massive destabilization of our biosphere, of our ecosystems, and huge increasing vulnerabilities in our populations, either due to migration, nutritional deficiency, and we're seeing a convergence of risks and vulnerabilities that we have never ever seen before on this planet. So the bringing together of policy at global level and commitment and investment has never ever been more important. We lost a lot in this pandemic. We lost loved ones, we lost sometimes hope, but we gained in innovation. We showed how resilient our communities are. And we did build infrastructure, really important infrastructure in surveillance. We learned how to deal with mass casualties in every single country at one time. We learned how to cope, and we do not want to lose those gains. But we need to learn from those challenges and then move forward. So the idea of creating a global health architecture for emergencies that's aligned with UHC, as was said before by Mr. Kihara and Shiozaki, is exceptionally important. Again, with specifically in reference to what's worked, the discussions originally in the UK presidency around surveillance and genomics has evolved into the IPSN, the International Pathogen Surveillance Network, which we launched at the World Health Assembly this year under the leadership of Dr. Chikwe Egwezu, our Assistant Director General here. We have worked very closely with the German presidency of the G7 and continuing to work with Japan on the Global Health Emergency Corps and Rapid Response Team Initiative, which was initiated by Minister Lauterbach on the German side and continued by Japan. And obviously, we continue to work on medical countermeasures, both in terms of the development of upstream countermeasures, but as Japan has so very clearly led on, how do we translate vaccines into vaccination? How do we translate therapeutics into care and lives saved? And the downstream elements that we need to be able to put in place to integrate these countermeasures into the system, not necessarily verticalize everything, because that was one of the shortcomings of this pandemic. Another important element, I think, is that the upcoming high-level meeting, the international negotiating body on a new treaty or accord, and the work on other governance mechanisms like IHR revisions means that we are moving forward steadily on governance. We're moving forward steadily on financing. We're moving forward steadily on the systems we're going to need in the future. Keeping all of that aligned politically in terms of the work of the G7, the G20, the member states of WHO, the member states of the United Nations system is a challenge. And then bringing in our civil society partners, bringing in the broader partnerships, and many of those partners are here today, particularly regional partners, private sector partners. This is not an easy task for any of us. And I would like to recognize the effort that everybody has made to try and keep coherence and drive coherence, and the flexibility and compromise that everyone has shown to try and align our activities. It's not always easy. We come from different perspectives with different pressures on us. And I do thank Japan and the presidency of Japan and this G7 for really bringing us together once again to drive that coherent approach. We owe that to the millions we lost in the pandemic, and we owe that to our children, that the next pandemic, we will be in a much better situation to respond. So as we move forward, finally, I believe that there is much to be gained coming from the Japanese presidency going forward. It's really important that we have that continuity between the G7 and G20, or that coherence. And it's even more important that the broader discussion amongst the member states of our organization continues to occur. We will continue to do that through medical countermeasures. We will, through a process of a network of networks of medical countermeasures, we will continue to do that as WHO. And again, on behalf of Dr. Tedros, I just want to thank all of the partners here today. The job is not done. The challenges are huge, but the coherence and the collaboration shown thus far has been outstanding. And we'd like to thank you all for that. And Scott may speak later as part of the panel discussion on some more specifics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Your talk is always very clear and encouraging. Thank you very much. So the panel discussion, we start. And as I said, this panel discussion is to make the G7's commitment to be realized. But first, I'd like to all the panelists to limit each intervention to 3 minutes and keep your video on throughout the discussions so that I can see who would like to make intervention. And G7 this time Japanese G7 really try to the link between the UHC and PPR, and it's very critical to sustain our efforts to enhance capacities, for PPR and the resilience of health systems. And as you know, always on approach, not just only for emergency, but also for current pandemic and others also should be needed. So as we all aware that capacities, cannot be built up in a day. So today I'd like to get panelists' reflection on the G7's commitment and focus on what actions can be taken as the first step to realize the G7's commitment for greater resilience to future pandemic and even current pandemics and endemics. And what issues should we discuss further to realize that G7's commitment? So as for the discussion topics, I'd like to take up 3 issues or areas. One, access to medical countermeasures, MCM for short, and workforce and financing. So first, I'd like to focus on timely and equitable access. So as Mr. Kihara shared with you that the Hiroshima G7 summit adopted G7 Hiroshima vision for the equitable access to medical countermeasures, MCM, to create enabling environments to make MCM more accessible. It's critical to enhance a comprehensive infrastructure, such as R&D funding, regulatory harmonization, alignment, clinical trials, etc. for MCM during non-crisis times. So what action do you think necessary at the first step that you can take for creating such an environment? And what actions are you expecting from others? Okay, so we have a very outstanding panelist. First, Dr. Ahmed Ogwell Omar, because he wanted to go first because his connection seems a bit kind of fragile. So, so Ahmed, go ahead. He is a Deputy Director General, African CDC.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Prof, for that and a good moderation, very good conversation that is going on. Yes, my connection is not very good, so I wanted to chip in before it gets worse. So first is to thank JCIE for inviting Africa CDC to participate, and of course to congratulate the G7 and the G20 for the focus that they've had on health security in general and health more broadly. It has helped to take forward our conversation around preparedness, prevention, towards any future pandemic that may be able to come. At Africa CDC, we are fully supportive of these conversations. And today I would like to pass 2 messages. One is the need to do this together. And every little contribution helps. Every contribution contributes to the larger need and the larger gap that we have within the health security architecture. The second message I'd like to pass is the need for synergy. We have quite a number of initiatives by different institutions, by different member states, by different formations, and they need to be speaking to each other. For example, what the G7 has done needs to be speaking to what the G20 are currently doing, so that we have synergy there. Secondly, we have 3 very important processes that are going on at the same time. We have the INB for the pandemic accord. We have the IHR being reviewed, and we also have the high-level meeting expected later on at the UN General Assembly this year. These 3 are very important, apart from the other initiatives, MCM and others that are going on, even at the regional level, sub-regional levels. These need to speak to each other so that every discussion, every report, every idea is actually going to contribute to the whole. So for us here at Africa CDC and Africa in general, we would like to see that synergy resulting in speed of action, so that our contributions are realizing results as soon as is possible and contributing to the larger vision of ensuring that we are better prepared for the next outbreak, better prepared for the next pandemic. This is my message to you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Actually, I have a request. We are really kind of paying attention to, the African CDCs and the kind of movement in Africa. But, nowadays, flight costs from Japan, especially to Africa, very costly. And they take so much time. So please, share information, even through, your website and others, so that we can get to know that what you really need and what's kind of a good progress, so that, you can, disseminate that kind of request, ask information, whatever, so that we can learn and we can also, work with you, right? Okay, thank you very much, Ahmed. Okay, so next, Dr. Richard Hatchett, CEO, CEPI. So could I ask you to speak about the challenges that we are facing toward equitable access and sustainable financing, and what should be done to accelerate progress? Or you can add whatever you want to talk. Hi, Richard, go ahead.
Well, great. Kuni-san, welcome and thank you for having me, and Shiozaki-san, very nice to hear your message. And it was also, of course, very nice to hear Mr. Kihara and Mr. Agarwal talking about the convergence of the G7 and G20 agendas. I was really struck by Shiozaki-san's review of the Hiroshima vision, particularly its focus on the global health architecture, UHC, and R&D and innovation. Very striking how those issues remain with us. I think our experience in recent years adds to the chorus calling for equitable access to countermeasures. Mike Ryan, in his message, mentioned the steady progress that we are making on multiple fronts that I think will create opportunities for us to advance the cause of equitable access. The ecosystem, of course, is evolving rapidly. There are important new institutional solutions, the Pandemic Fund. Mike also mentioned the International Pathogen Surveillance Network. I would mention the 100-Day Mission, and we're very grateful to Japan for its continued elevation of the 100-Day Mission and its support. We have examples over the last few years of imperfect but vastly improved mechanisms of international collaboration. I would mention COVAX, the ACT Accelerator, the COVID vaccine delivery program, which accelerated access to vaccines in the poorest countries and greatly increased completion of primary vaccine series. And of course, we also have new medical countermeasure enterprises joining CEPI, joining BARDA, like SCARDA, like HERA. There's PrepVax in Singapore, VitalK in Korea, many others. Brino is here representing the Toscana Life Sciences effort. So there is a tremendous amount of energy pouring into the system. We do need to understand how to link these efforts, link them with our partners in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, South America, and elsewhere to advance the cause of equitable access. I want to just conclude by applauding Japan's commitment to addressing the gaps in equitable access to medical countermeasures through the G7 Hiroshima vision for equitable access. I think we have opportunities through the INB process to establish new norms about information sharing, data sharing. One of the things that CEPI has advocated strongly for, we acted on this during the pandemic, we call on our national partners to emulate us, is to use public sector financing of critical R&D for medical countermeasures development to secure both obviously for the national entities commitments for their own national publics, but also global access commitments through these new mechanisms that have been created. I think we can look forward to a brighter future as a result, but it will require continued work, continued collaboration, continued effort. Kuni-san, thank you for the time.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you very much for your leadership, especially coordination of, the PPR, especially in this, the vaccine development. Yeah, your organizational kind of work is really great. Thank you. Okay, so next is Dr. Yasuhiro Fujiwara. He is the head of the CEO of a Pharmaceutical and Medical Devices Agency, PMDA, in Japan. So as a head of a regulatory authority, in order to ensure timely access to new medical tools, what actions can you take? And also, we really expect you to make a great effort on the alignment and also really kind of a networking among that stringent agencies. So floor is yours.
Thank you, Kuni-san, for giving me a chance to participate in today's discussions. And thank you very much, Mr. Kihara-san, Shiozaki-san, and Professor Takemi. From the point of regulatory matter, I would like to comment something. And also, in promoting end-to-end MCM ecosystem, it is significant to take measures based on the life cycle of medical products. While various existing bodies have already taken necessary measures, it is important how to effectively and practically combine them in parallel to achieving these existing activities. Especially there exists regulatory activities such as ICMRA. I'm a vice chair for ICMRA, which is regarded as successful practices during the pandemic. And ICMRA will continuously play critical role on international harmonization. On the other hand, it is also significant to consider how to link development matters with regulatory fields. In this respect, we need to promote clinical development matters and then need to strengthen the base for clinical trial and global cooperation among regions. In addition, it is indispensable for regulatory authorities to collaborate among them and take consistent measures so that the results of clinical trials can lead to approval as soon as possible. From this context, I believe that the development of and promotion of Asian basis of clinical development, as well as the development of the PMDA's Asian office, which were led by Dr. Takemi, would provide internationally essential infrastructure. We have to note that we need to not only to proceed approval, but also to ensure safety and quality, as well as in order for people to understand our efforts appropriately, we need to take adequate safety and quality measures using robust data. I believe it will become even more significant to incorporate such an activity into international trends. And please refer to the last year's WHO's World Health Assembly, number 75.8. That's describing the strength in clinical trials to provide high quality evidence on health interventions and to improve research quality and coordinations. So my conclusion is that please recognize the importance of clinical trials and regulatory cooperations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fujiwara-sensei. So next is Dr. Amado Alvasal, the General Administrator, Institute Pasteur of Dakar. So please, Amado, please share that progress that your institute has made to respond to ongoing pandemic and health threats and prepare for the future pandemics. And also what kind of capacities should be strengthened and what kind of a partnership you need for enhancing such capacities. Dr. Amado, floor is yours. Dr. Amado, he's not there. Okay, then why don't we go to a next one, and if Amado join, I will ask again him. Okay, so next is Dr. Rino Rapoli, the Scientific Director, Biotecnopolo di Siena Foundation. Okay, so Dr. Rapoli, equitable access cannot be assured without mechanisms for de-risking the investment by private sector. So are there any missing functions or mechanisms to be strengthened?
Well, thank you. I will basically talk today in two areas. One is the scientific director of a new Center for Pandemic Preparedness that Italy has decided to set up to invest on. It's called National Center for Pandemic Preparedness. And this is a center that basically joins all the other initiatives globally to prepare for pandemics. And this is funded for the public sector. I will answer your question about the private sector at the end of this. And so this will be a center that will be devoted to discover new countermeasures from early discovery to phase 2B emergency approval. We'll focus on two things. One, antimicrobial resistance, and the other, emerging viruses. For the antimicrobial resistance, I've seen that is a priority for the Japan G7, the G20, and will continue to be a priority for the Italian G7 next year. And in fact, we are already working together with Carbex. We will focus mostly on vaccines and monoclonals. And we will focus on the third objectives on sustainable and accessible solutions, because technically it's very important to do that from the very beginning. In terms of how we plan to basically look at the rest of the international community, is obviously the, as been said so far, cooperation is essential. The way I look at the preparing for preparedness for pandemic is basically I see that all the actors, the NIH, the Wellcome Trust, CEPI, European Union, HERAD, African Union, South America, Japan, all governments, they all need to work together. None of them will be able to do the entire work together or alone, but if we divide the piece of the work and each one without overlapping take a piece of it, then we can reach the goals of making prototype vaccines and antibodies, and the mission, we can accomplish the mission 100 days very easily. Now, the question is, your very important question is how we're gonna do that and what kind of investment do we need? Well, I firmly believe that the preparing the world for a better and more equitable health, preparing for pandemics, is an investment that the public sector has to do. And the public sector has to basically come up with solutions that will basically make the pandemic preparedness also a priority for the private sector. Just an example, I think that in the past pandemic, we have seen that this pandemic costed 28 trillion to the global economy. And there's been a moment where the United States decided to do the Operation Warp Speed and spend 12.5 billion, and people thought it was a huge expense. In fact, it was the best investment that's ever been done, because those 12.5 billion, which were done in support to the private sector, basically were repaid by just anticipating the availability of vaccines by 12 hours. So I think we need a solution where the public sector and the private sector, they need to work together, but we do need a big investment from the public sector. And hopefully the G7, G20 will be able to go in this direction. Overall, I see a lot of continuity from the excellent work done in Japan, and I hope in Italy we'll be able to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you very much. since the next G7 summit will be hosted by Italy. So I hope your role will be also very important. And also please invite Japanese and other countries, private sectors, and please activate discussion. Yeah, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so can I move to our next question? Maybe FIFA, you want to answer some of the question, but maybe I will give you a slot. So other time, please, answer some of the question. So, okay, so MCM, delivery partnership will be launched by the end of this year, as the Kihara-san mentioned. So as we witnessed in our response to COVID-19, we rely heavily on the existing health systems that aim for equitable delivery even during the health emergencies. So how can we ensure health systems, especially in MCM delivery, are strengthened to respond to unseen disease through ongoing efforts? Is there any better approach to strengthen resilience of a health system? So first, I want to ask Dr. Sania Nishta, a member of the Senate of Pakistan and also UHC Movement Political Advisory Panel, UHC 2030. So Sania, how do you think we can strengthen the resilience to future pandemics through the existing health programs in your country?
Thank you for that important question, and good day to everybody. I was a bit concerned to hear that Takemi-san is not well, so please give him my best regards, and I hope that he recovers very soon. In terms of your question, I want to reflect on that both from the global and country perspectives, because I have worked both at the global level and then at the country level. I have served in a cabinet. In fact, I was a member of the cabinet when COVID-19 struck our country. And my experience is that at the global level, we sometimes forget there is only one health system at a country level. So regardless of the health services that we are talking about, whether they're maternal and child health services, or whether it is cancer care or emergency services, or whether it's vaccination to treat COVID-19, it's actually delivered through the same health system in a country at a country level. And we often forget that when planning at the global level, where we have so many different programmatic streams and so many different initiatives. And we saw this one health system operating very clearly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Primary health care during that time was the first point of contact for nearly all people, both for essential as well as COVID-19 services. So if there is one lesson we have hopefully learned also for the MCM delivery partnership, it is that we cannot treat strengthening resilient and equitable health systems as a separate goal from delivering medical countermeasures in emergencies. We have to appreciate that UHC and health security are delivered through the same health system, both in crisis as well as in calm. And this is why the UHC action agenda, which has also been picked up by the G7 health ministers as an annex to their communique, highlighted that UHC and health security must be connected. I couldn't agree more with this, and I think that was brilliant articulation in the annex. So in practice, this means that we cannot say we are strengthening emergency preparedness and delivery if we are not strengthening national health systems. Now, this also means that we need to double down on implementation and action. There are lots of global opportunities with Japan's G7 presidency. There's the upcoming G20 meetings. There are 3 important health-related UN high-level meetings in September. There are other important health-related processes, such as the pandemic accord negotiations. And in all of these, I think it's imperative that we need to ensure that UHC and health security are connected, and that we do not fragment health systems in the global health architecture further. Because I strongly believe, and at the cost of repeating things, I really strongly believe that we can only achieve universal health coverage and resilience to future pandemics if we connect these two. To me, actually, these are the 2 sides of the same coin. Thank you very much, and over back to you.
Thank you very much, Sania. Always a very clear message. Thank you. Okay, so next is Mr. Peter Sands, Executive Director of a Global Fund, actually my former boss. And yeah, Global Fund really, played a critical role even in this COVID-19 response. And you were also thinking to, develop especially the marketing and shaping approach and revolving facility. So would you kindly share that your thought on this, the especially market shaping facilities and etc. Peter, floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Sam. And as always, it's a pleasure to be with you. And also it's a privilege to be at an event with Honorable Shiozaki, Honorable Kihara, and Professor Takemi, although sadly he is not here. I also want to commend the leadership of Japan and India through their respective roles in leading the G7 and G20 and in ensuring that all these complex processes that we're engaged in are sort of working together towards a common goal. I just want to start by building on the points made by the Senator just a moment ago. I think it is very good to frame what we are talking about in terms of pandemic preparedness and medical countermeasures in the broader context of an ambition around UHC, of providing health services to all, of improving the health and well-being of all, and that we don't allow ourselves to think of this as yet another silo, which we in the global health community are quite good at creating silos, and we should avoid that temptation here. In terms of specifically the medical countermeasures aspect, as you say, we played a reasonably significant role in the COVID-19 response, not on the vaccine side, but on diagnostics, oxygen, treatment, PPE, and enhancements to health systems. And we're very engaged in all the discussions now with partners around the development of a new and medical countermeasures platform. A couple of things that I think are important about this. One is that I think it needs to be very flexible, because we don't actually know what the nature of the next challenge is going to be. So we don't know the relative balance of different types of tool we're going to need, or where in the world we're going to need them. The second thing is that we shouldn't think about this as divorced from the way that we provide medical tools to fight existing diseases. Indeed, my view is that we should take all we've learned around accelerating the introduction and deployment of tools to apply to the existing diseases. We should be, in a sense, strengthening our institutional and collective muscles on diseases like tuberculosis, A, because it'll save lives now, and B, because by doing that, we will get better at responding to the next pathogen that emerges. But as the Senator and others have emphasized, it's not just about getting the new medicines, vaccines, or whatever in the countries. You have to be able to deliver them. And that's where the health system becomes important. And the thing I think we always have to reflect on is that a system of health is fundamentally, on the formal side, about healthcare workers. That's where the real money goes. We spend a lot of time talking about equipment and infrastructure and things, but actually most of the investment, and the thing that is typically the limiting factor when you're trying to move rapidly, is the availability of trained health workers. But the other aspect I would emphasize is also community systems for health. If we want to reach the poorest and most marginalized, and they are disproportionately at risk whenever there is an infectious disease threat, we need the engagement of communities and civil society organizations in all their richness and diversity. And we need to be doing that in the ongoing business of preparedness, and not just try and mobilize it when we have a problem, because that's too late. So the fundamental thing I would be emphasizing is this sort of point that we need to take an integrated approach to medical countermeasures and pandemic preparedness more generally, framing it within the UHC ambition, framing it within our broader conception of how we're trying to improve the health and well-being of people. I'd also reinforce the point that we shouldn't take too narrow a lens. Some of the discussions I hear about medical countermeasures and pandemic preparedness focus very much on the next COVID-19, the next new pathogen. But as others have said, antimicrobial resistance is not a low probability event, but a certainty and an increasing threat. But what we're also seeing is the disruptive impact of climate change. I suspect many of the disease emergencies we're going to be facing over the next few years are not actually going to be of totally new pathogens, but they're going to be because the dynamics of existing pathogens have changed due to the impact of climate change. So the way we think about medical countermeasures, resilience of health systems needs to be flexible in the context of these kind of multiple threats that we face. Specifically on the Global Fund, we are, as you mentioned, very actively involved with partners around reinforcing our whole approach to market shaping. Everything from our engagement to with pharmaceutical manufacturers and others who are developing new drugs, all the way through to the deployment in the field to the people hardest to reach of the same drugs, and trying to collapse the timeframes in which that happens. And we brought in a revolving facility. We're doing a bunch of different things to help do that. But it isn't something that any one agency can do. This is something that requires WHO, it requires UNITAID, it requires organizations like CEPI and FIND, all working in partnership. And that, I think, is the core challenge as we think about the kind of network of networks approach and the MCM, is how do we make that as streamlined, but also as flexible as possible. So at the Global Fund, we are very much committed to playing our part as the G7 and G20 agendas around this evolve. And we're excited to be in partnership with all the players represented here. Thanks, Sam.
Peter, thank you very much. Thank you. So next is World Bank. Today, I invite Dr. Monique Freda, the practice manager for Global Health, Nutrition and Population Unit, World Bank, and also the former head of Secretariat, GFF. So can I ask how to ensure that the health systems are emergency ready, or, World Bank is also really spending so much money and investment in this health system. So you can talk about that.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and to JCIE for organizing. And also wanted to start off by congratulating the government of Japan for the leadership and the vision, including what Prime Minister Kishida laid out in the Lancet in January, which very much coincide with our perspectives. And we're in full support of the focus on governance and financial measures to strengthen PPR and to create sustainable, resilient health systems. I'd like to talk a little bit more, building on the previous panelists, on the issue around health systems. And we're particularly very grateful to the Japanese government for highlighting the continuous importance and emphasis on UHC. And we think that concept plays out not on the global level, but on country level. And we'd like to talk a little bit more about that. And so for us at the World Bank, our investments are all investments in health systems. And so when we look at our current portfolio, we have $34 billion in financing in over 100 countries, with over 230 projects making investments in health systems. And in the dialogue we have with the client countries, it is clear, and many of the other participants have talked about that that there are multiple shocks that are actually making the health outcomes worse. The lasting impact of COVID, the food crisis and economic crisis really impacting nutrition outcomes and worsening nutrition outcomes. We see that in many countries. And then the destabilizing impact of the climate effect on health. And we really are advocating for putting health central in the climate change approach, ensuring that particularly that risk as related to the increases we're seeing in many of the countries we engage in infectious disease outbreaks. So many more mini outbreaks that have the risk to become a major outbreaks. And so we are working with our partners and particularly our client governments and civil society to transition all of World Bank's health system investments to ensure that they are responsive to that new reality on country level. And for us, that means that every health investment we make, it will need to have a PPR public health component. It will need to heavily focus on strengthening that comprehensive package of primary healthcare community-based services. And it needs to ensure that it reaches those most vulnerable and target those populations that are most in need, particularly also because those are the people that are further impoverishing because of the catastrophic expenditures that they have related to health. And so all that very much in line with the UHC concept. And we're excited to see the connections between the G7 and the G20, the opportunities that we have collectively as a global health community around the PPR and UHC high-level events. But we want to continue arguing and putting our focus that this is a country agenda. We will not make progress unless we build local capacity to really be able to manage and deal with these multiple shocks that people are facing in this moment in time. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I also hope that Professor Takemi will improve soon, and look forward to being in Tokyo myself early September to continue these discussions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Monique. Okay, so next is Fifar Rahman, the Special Advisor, Health Poverty Action. So you have been involved in the Facilitation Council of ACTA, the ACTA Accelerator, and the current discussion of the MCM platform. So how to enhance infrastructure for timely and equitable access to MCM and missing functions or mechanisms for de-risking the investment by private sector, and also how to strengthen health systems for MCM delivery through ongoing efforts. Okay, Fifar, floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Kuni-san, and thanks to JCIE for having me. Firstly, let me thank the G7 leadership on health outcomes that came out of the Hiroshima summit. These remain critically important and must build upon learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic. Firstly, let me state that I agree completely with Peter that you can have MCMs, but you need to be able to deliver them. One of the things that we learned from the ACT Accelerator was the great success of the COVID-19 vaccine delivery partnership, which really got to the crux of the overlapping issues as to why certain people were not taking up these vaccines. In South Sudan, for example, vaccines were initially rolled out only in big hospitals, meaning that rural women in particular, who might not have had the financial abilities and decision-making power to access these. The work of COVDP, for example, through UNICEF South Sudan and Ministry of Health was critical towards tailoring vaccination programs to increasing uptake by women. These programs were supported by community health workers. 14% of community health workers in Africa are salaried, so there's a lot more to go. So what we need to do is to support and respect community systems, and that includes by offering salaries and opportunities for upskilling. We note the G7 Hiroshima vision for equitable access to MCMs talks about agility and equity, and a more coordinated governance for health emergencies. This requires a gender, vulnerability, equity, and human rights lens at the outset to ensure uptake of all technologies, and this includes in the medical countermeasures platform and MCM delivery partnership. Without this lens, MCM interventions will need correction and recorrection, reducing both agility and equity. We think it's important that this agenda continues into the next presidency as well. We'd like to see an increased focus on diagnostics and therapeutics, and particularly diagnostics that are well suited to complex local environments. In Madagascar, for example, where road infrastructure into villages is very poor, we need point of care and quality self-testing closer to people's homes and workplaces and available for free, which currently they are not. These approaches are only possible through meaningful application of core principles of UHC, including an INB, IHR, and other major health security mechanisms. The Hiroshima vision also emphasizes inclusivity. My intervention illustrates, I hope, the technical expertise that civil society brings to the table and how we can be an asset to G7 leadership. We would like to see civil society more consultatively engaged with the G7. Our inboxes are open to all of you to co-create and lend context in health decision-making spaces. And Shiozaki-san spoke about how do we bring about the best in civil society, and opening up those spaces and providing financing for Global South civil society to engage is a first step rather than engaging us peripherally. And we look forward to working with the G7 to make this a reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fifa. Okay, so we move to the third kind of question. So in order to prevent and respond to pandemic effectively, strengthening human resources is also critical. So in addition to our health workforce, the G7 stated, we need a multidisciplinary team and networks among them, such as Global Health Emergency Corps. So Sania, again, can I ask under the limited financial and human resources in low and middle income countries, what steps can countries take to strengthen human resources more responsible to new outbreaks?
So thank you for that important question. Thank you for that important question. Let me say right at the very outset that Japan has indeed, during its G7 presidency, highlighted that we need to strengthen health security in UHC in all countries. Now, what does this fundamentally depend upon? And all along, all of us have been saying that functioning and strong health systems are critical for delivery. And when you talk about health systems, there are many components of the health system. Traditionally, we talk about the 6 building blocks of a health system, from governance to pharmaceutical and medical devices, to financing, to the service delivery piece, to technology. And one of the most important pillars of the health system are human resources. Now, I realize that the G7 members play a very important role in supporting the low and middle income country through networks and collaboration and that work for detection and response in emergencies. But we also know that the core response has to come from national health systems, particularly primary health care. And for that, national leadership, investments in human resource, and increased domestic financing is absolutely key. And this is the only way we can ensure that we have reached the scale and the quality and the effectiveness that is required to detect and respond to outbreaks and threats. We really have to appreciate that in our current times of multiple crises and the global fiscal landscape, which is really squeezed down, we cannot just rely on external assistance. And in fact, that has been the great transformation from the MDGs to the SDGs, because implicit in the MDGs was this notion of the donor-recipient relationship, where the G7 countries who had a lot of fiscal space would go to developing countries and negotiate compacts of assistance, with certain time-bound outcome-based goals as endpoints. But the narrative of the SDGs really changed that. It talked about country ownership, country financing, it talked about accountability, about delivery, about partnerships. So we really need countries to take ownership and to finance and prioritize investments in the health care system more broadly, and the health workforce in particular. And they need to ensure that human resources in the low and middle income countries are built and sustained also for the long term, not just for isolated tasks. Of course, the global community has a role to play here in terms of capacity building, in terms of strategy inputs, in terms of training. But the core long-term inputs have to come from countries. And when you talk about human resources for health, there is a qualitative aspect to it. There's a quantitative aspect to it. There's training and skill building and ongoing education. And I would say that human resources for health is part of the human capital building agenda in a country. We know that today, the human capital is the key resource of a country. And of course, the human capital thinking has to extend to human capital building for the health systems as well. So in summary, I think that whereas the global roles are important, but it's the country leadership and investments in human capital, in human resource, which is vital for the outcomes that we're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much, Sania. Okay, next, can I ask Dr. Valerie Beno, Deputy Director, Emergency Response and Health, Bill Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation. So my question is, how can the G7 and the global community support countries and track progress and Gates that effort on that? Valerie?
Thank you so much for bringing me today here. I first also have to add my voice to all the panelists to actually commend Japan for the leadership. And we know that Japan have been, from the beginning of COVID, we saw that leadership as Japan started responding. I remember the princess, the boat, and that leadership we learned from Japan around the world. I have to say, and following on the Sanya, I think it's a really good space to say that the first things we can do, things are global, but the first level is at the national level. We need national leadership. We need national ownership of the work, but we can't do the national, each country doing their own, it will be chaotic. From there, we need to think about how the regional play a role. And I'm glad that you brought the different group here. And then from there, the global level. I think the global level, as we saw with COVID, we need a coordinated approach. We need to bring different leaders from the countries around the world together, but we also know that we can't do that just in isolation at ad hoc. We need to be prepared. We need to actually have all these leaders already talking to each other, creating that trust, so that exercising together, so that next pandemic, they will be able to bring together the political leadership, the global leadership together. To answer your question more particularly, what the global level need to do, I think many of the previous panelists mentioned that really eloquently, but I want to focus on one thing or few things. First, we know that the next pandemic, we don't know where it will start, how it will start. We don't know what type of disease will be, and we don't know what will be the mortality. This time it was maybe 1%. We don't know even what the population. And we have to be ready for that. As Mag Ryan said earlier, it will be a shame of all of us if we don't do that in advance, if we don't respond to do that, and we own it for the next generation. At the global level, we have been supporting actually the leadership from WHO will be critical. For me, we cannot go as silo and we cannot go as different entity trying to do the same thing, because at the end, it's still chaos. And remember, the world and the different countries, we need everybody together, including the low medium income countries, the low income countries, and the high income countries together. And only organizations like WHO can actually help us to coordinate, to collaborate, and to put all our effort together. And I really would like to the global level to think about this should not be an ad hoc, this should not be a volunteer, because a lot of the time we ask this leader to have 20 other things and ask them to put their time as a volunteer, as a ad hoc, as a if you have time. And of course, by default, they never had time. I'll ask all countries to really prioritize it, to make it part of their leaders' job description, to make it part of their leader agenda as prioritizing. And that means that they need to maybe get something else. They need to have funding. They need to have support. And across the world, some countries can afford it, like Japan or the G7 or some of the G20. But a lot of the other countries cannot afford it. How can we be more collaborative to work together to make sure that no matter what economic background your country are, this is taken care of? Because the pandemic doesn't have borders. There's no borders. If it's happening anywhere else, make sure that with the global world we are, it will reach all of us. Then we have as a global sector to be able to put. And then when a country cannot be able to respond appropriately because the resources are not enough or it's too big, then we can think about the surge, but we need to be coordinated. Who do we send? How do we send? How do we put in place system that can actually contribute to make sure that we have a better way to coordinate? How do we send people? How do we send? Because there's a lot of training going on, but it's not enough. Collaboration, leadership is essential. Thank you.
Thank you, Verily. So we have another 8 minutes. So shall we move to last question? So G7 has recognized that the increasing need for overarching system-level coordination and alignment of global health partnerships. So coordination and alignment should be enhanced behind country-owned plan and based on analysis of financial and functional gaps. How to enhance countries' capacity to mobilize and manage financing for UHC and PPR. So can I ask this question to Sand, Peter? Are you ready? Peter might be quite busy, so can I ask this question to Melinda, the World Bank?
Great, thank you very much. And maybe also if I can just take 2 minutes to comment on the human resources for health, just because it's such an important topic. So I wanted to make the point that the majority, we tend to focus a lot on external financing and spend a lot of time in the global health space discussing that, and rightly so. There are large amounts of funding available and they need to be well deployed. But the majority of funding for health comes from the domestic budget and out of pocket, so private expenses. And so really, when you look at the majority of financing that goes to health on country level, it's domestic funding. And so this is also why it's so important, and that relates to your second question, that when we look and engage on country level and build capacity, we build capacity for evidence building and for national level priority setting, and where donors can align to the national priorities, and where there's capacity for national governments to set those priorities, provide leadership, and for donors to come in a less fragmented way, by funding those priorities in these national, highly prioritized, high quality plans. And I think that's something that there's still space to make the connection between what happens on national level and how the global funders support that kind of approach collectively. And there's still, in my view, too much of setting your own flag in terms of how the external funding then comes into national level priority setting. And I wanted to make one other point around human resources. Our focus is on shortage oftentimes, which is correct. There is a public health crisis when it comes to human resources, and there's a large shortage that need to be addressed, but there are also issues around the existing staff and the quality of care that they deliver, as well as the management and efficiency of the system. And so sometimes a graduated doctor, it takes 2.5 years for the government to issue a contract for the first job. And so these kind of things are not so sexy to talk about, but they're really important to change in terms of taking full advantage of the human resource availability. And finally, there's a gender dimension that we ask women to do volunteer jobs and enroll men in formal employment. And so there's an opportunity in the health sector to look differently at that. So I also wanted to just point out Dr. Evans' point in the chat related to the global discussions around shortage of human resources, and the fact that our aging Western societies need more human resources that they're drawing from developing countries. And this might also be an issue that might be of great interest to the G7 and the continuation of those conversations on global level. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frela. Okay, so lastly, can I ask Mr. Scott Pendergast, Director of Health Emergency Strategy Program and Partnership. You can kind of wrap up, or you can give that kind of a feedback to the all kind of questions, or you can just point out. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And thanks to all the panelists and the great discussion. And also I'd like to just extend thanks to the G7 for the leadership in this area. So maybe just a slight sort of wrap up, I think, from our side, because obviously we're working across many and in fact all of these different initiatives. And maybe I'll just start with the points that were made around the fact that health emergency preparedness and response doesn't sit separately to the health system. It has to be fully embedded into resilient health systems, resilient community systems. But having said that, it's a very specific set of capabilities that we need to be able to be prepared for and respond to emergencies. So it's capabilities around integrated disease surveillance, around integrated laboratories for rapid testing, bringing that information together for better decision-making in a collaborative way, working, as was said, with communities, both in terms of listening to communities, managing misinformation, disinformation, co-creating with communities the public health and social interventions and population-based interventions needed. The whole range of multi-sectoral capabilities required, from preventing spillover events to vector control, to scaling emergency vaccination, implementing public health and social measures, and also the work that needs to be done beyond the health sector in the social and economic protection to enable communities to actually participate in health response. And then in terms of the health system, not just having more strengthened health systems, but having health systems that are agile, that can rapidly redeploy scalable clinical care, both in terms of scalable infrastructure, rapidly deployable workforce, that are really focusing on being able to prevent infection prevention, or through infection prevention and control, and protect health workers, as well as being able to maintain the essential health services during emergencies. So there's a lot of skills that are needed, and I think this is very much well picked up in also the work that we need to do around capacity building for the workforce. But once again, there's also key functions within that, core public health functions that really need to be professionalized at national level and supported, so as that there can be a specific group at national level that are constantly looking at the threats and the vulnerabilities, that are working on the planning in terms of prioritizing actions for preparedness, as well as then being able to do that rapid alert, case investigation, rapid response, and scaling coordination across sectors. So we need to balance between the broader systems approach and then really looking at the very specific functional capability that we need to strengthen for better preparedness and response. And a lot was mentioned actually also about the partnerships that are needed for this. The sectors that we've just mentioned are very broad. There's lots of different partners that are involved in a piece or some pieces of each of these. So really being able to scale that delivery partnerships across those different areas is going to be critical, not just at the national, but increasingly importantly at the regional and looking at the political regional groupings and strengthening there, and then connecting the global and the regional at the end of the day to support national systems. And really, it's that national level strengthening and subnational capabilities that are going to really be the ones that we need in the future. And then linking that, as was said, to the upstream access to countermeasures in terms of the fast-track R&D and having at-risk financing, having clear benefit sharing agreements in place for how we scale R&D, having the clinical trials, the emergency use licensing, and then importantly, having a distributed manufacturing and scalable manufacturing capability through licensing and tech transfer, and a much better coordination in terms of the procurement and the supply chain. So having demand aggregation, having clarity about where different people have access to products, but also then looking at aggregation in terms of procurement pools and equitable allocation in the middle. So I think a lot of this work is going on in multiple different initiatives, and we're, as Mike said, very happy that the G7, the G20, the WHO, the UN, broader discussions, the partnership discussions in their own boards are getting aligned. It's a very complicated environment, but there is a lot of dialogue. And we're hoping as we go forward, we'll be able to put in the right systems for governance, put in better mechanisms for being able to have sustainable and predictable financing, and really focus on what are the key system function capabilities that we need to build together in support of the national governments that we work for. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. And thank you very much, everyone. Time's up, but and also thank you very much for a lot of questions, given. Actually, we are unable to respond to question, but we'll collect all kind of question and try to, provide a follow-up answers, or at least share what kind of questions are there, because always quite important to understand, the questions, and we also ask why, and what and how to do these things. So thank you very much for joining. We really need to, this is kind of kickoff events. So each kind of start, and we try to, make these, general discussions and also the comments into a more kind of a specific actions. And we are planning to have kind of a meeting in November. And also, this is quite important momentum. The G7 always, they try to kind of create momentum and just move. But we shouldn't terminate in each G7, but we need to hand over this kind of momentum to next one, meaning, G7 in that Italy, and also G20 in the Brazil. And we need to make quite specific actions, or actually, a lot of, actions are being made at this moment. So we also need to find the kind of gaps and how to make a more kind of strategically and collectively. So we need some your support and your contribution toward this, the handing over our kind of momentum and power to next G7. And at the same time, we also need to be continuing this, the efforts and also initiative for future. Thank you very much, all your participation and the contribution, and have a very good day or good night, and good morning. Thank you very much, all. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Kuni-san. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.